still running the business. Startup is that it's very, very rare in a startup for you to be a solo owner of the business or a solo founder, right? Typically startups have founding teams of 2 to 3 people, whereas in a small business, it can just be you, right, who is running your business, right? You also cannot expect to maintain majority control of the business, because as you're growing very fast, it also means that you're likely to bring in a lot of capital very early that dilutes your own equity. So it's just very important, right? Neither model is sort of like better than the other. But what is important is just for you to understand, for this business that I'm running, am I building a startup? Am I building a small business? Because once you're clear on that, you can then apply the principles that are relevant to each one to your own business. If you try to scale or raise capital for a small business like you do for a startup, you'll basically end up just either raising too much capital or just not even be able to raise the money at all. You will try to scale yourself too fast and you basically burn out, right? A small business is more of a marathon. A startup is a sprint. And so it's very, very different. Startups will have, very fast starts, and then after a while, it tapers out. While for a small business, it's basically slow and steady that wins the race. Then let's very quickly talk about how to raise finance, right? Very quickly, where are you today in your business journey? Whether you're a startup, this applies across, right? It's very important that, again, you're very clear on where are you in your business journey and therefore what is important for you to do at that time, right? So are you sort of in your idea stage where it's about how to raise money, right? The most important thing is, how do I validate this idea? What can I do myself to do it? Second is, you could be at like post-validation stage. So you validated the idea, wanting to get, typically finance is not your biggest problem. Your biggest problem is, and then, you could be at your growth stage where you actually have a lot of like paying customers. I think the journey from idea to growth for small businesses is typically quicker because, again, you kind of know exactly what to do. Whereas for a startup, you're probably the first person doing it. So it takes you a while to figure out, who are the customers that will pay for my product. And then post-growth, you get into expansion and then consolidation, right? And that's where I think capital starts to become a lot more relevant. So now let's get into, how do I raise finance for my business? Let's assume I'm clear on my why. I'm very clear that I'm building a small business or a startup and I know exactly what stage I am. How do I go about raising finance for my business? And there's sort of generally like four ways you can raise finance, right? I'm pretty sure it's not the first time that we're hearing most of this, but you can raise finance through equity. You can raise finance through debt, basically getting loans. You can raise finance through convertibles that are basically somewhere in between equity and debt, and then through grants. By the way, someone could just let me know just when I'm running out of time so I can be fast. I will focus a lot more on equity and debt because they're generally the most common, right? I think even convertibles in most times in this market are just really another form of equity, right? And then grants, I'm generally not a big fan of grants, right? Just because it's more relevant to if you're building to like a non-profit. But if you're a real business person, I think, grants come once in a while. If you get them, good for you. But you can never build a business strategy around grants. So I'll focus more on equity and on debt. So So let's start first with equity funding. Like I said, we're going to take this, just next slide. We're going to take this, there's a different strategy that works for a small business, and then there's a different strategy that works for a startup. So if you're running a small business, right, how do you think about equity funding? And by the way, I think equity funding, just to make sure that we're complete, is raising money and I'm giving up ownership in my business in exchange for the money, right? There are two sort of broad ways, that I think you can think about it. The first is around bootstrapping family and friends and just silent partners. The most common is bootstrapping, right? That is just, I have a business, I want to run a fashion business. I will just, start making some clothes, put some designs. I'll get, some of my friends to buy, and then we just start growing that way. And I think that is the most, it's the one thing that you have in your control is your own self, your own money, right? Everything else is completely outside of your control. And so, always try to use like your personal funds to start out, no matter how small it is. Sometimes it does mean that you need to still maintain a day job, and that is very, very, I think, there's nothing wrong with sort of keeping your day job because you still need like, a source of income, and a source to sort of finance, that business that you're trying to grow. Then leverage family and friends, right? I think they're the people that know you the best. Even for startups, right? Generally it's going to be very, very difficult for you to raise money from an external person if your family, nobody in your family, none of your friends believes in you enough to even invest 100,000 in you. If you can't find anybody within your immediate circle that believes in you enough to put in 100,000, 500,000, 1 million in your business, it's going to be very difficult for you to convince someone that does not know you, has never met you from Adam, to put money in your business. So family and friends is sort of always important, a relevant way to bring in money. You can also consider the option of what are people that are called silent partners, right? So these are people that maybe they're working somewhere, right? And they've been looking for ways to just diversify their income stream. And so, silent partners could invest in your business, but the reason why they are called silent is because they're not involved in the day-to-day running of the business, right? So they give you money, they get 20% of the business, you continue to run it, and you give them their share of the profits. Again, most likely they're going to be people within your network that know you and they trust you. The other option is raising like just actual funding from proper institutions, right, in terms of equity investment. Fortunately, unfortunately, in Nigeria, this is not a very, very developed way of raising funding for small businesses. There are not enough sort of institutions that are investing in traditional small businesses. And so I always encourage small businesses to focus more on the first one, or to look at like debt funding, at least if you're operating in Nigeria. However, there's still some very small niche firms, so people like Growfin and Co. would still invest equity funding in small businesses, just not a lot of them. And there are some, I think, new government programs now that are also, trying to drive equity funding in small businesses. There is one, if you're in the creative space, called, I think, CEDF. So if you're like in fashion or movies or anything creative, that could be something to check out for yourself. Next page. But if you're a startup, right, again, fortunately, unfortunately, there are probably a few more options for equity that are available to you. Bootstrapping is always, like I said, relevant, irrespective of whether you're running a startup or a small business. Just always important that you have skin in the game. You have put in some of And that could mean that you have money that you've saved up. It could mean that you keep a day job. It could mean that you even do sort of side gigs, right? For example, when we started Traction, I think for the first 1 year, we didn't raise any external capital. But myself and my co-founder, the one thing that we knew how to do was, in our former jobs, we were consultants. And so while we were still building the business, we were still doing consulting jobs on the side that was essentially allowing us to fund the business, right? So you should just think about, what skills do I have, right, that I can still spend a portion of my time doing while my business is still growing, right? What can I do that will still sort of bring in income, right? That's bootstrapping. Rating your first check again, you should look at like family and friends. And then I think, finally, I think there's obviously more options available to you, when it comes to actual, my idea is validated, I have customers. You can now start looking at things like accelerators, angel networks, venture capital funds, etc. I wouldn't go through sort of all of that detail. I think the material is available. I'm going to share that as well. Just to wrap up, and just go to this last slide, right? I think this is particularly relevant to small businesses. I think, like I said, most times debt is always, a better option, a more accessible option to you as a small business, right? So if you think about personal loans, again, from people that know you, there are a number of banks that are now much more open to giving credit to small businesses, right? Especially like merchant banks, right? So think about banks like FSDH, for example, some banks like Sterling are a lot more open to giving loans to smaller business. And then obviously always think about supplier credit. I think that's one that people don't utilize enough, right? Many times if you build good relationships with your suppliers, they would really fund your growth because they'll give you things on credit. And if you're running a service business, think about invoice factoring as well, right? Where I have an invoice from a large company, someone gives me money, and I can basically discount that invoice. So there's going to be Q&A, so I'm sure there's a lot of things that we haven't fully covered. But I think hopefully this was helpful. I know that business expansion is tough. Raising finance in this market is tough, but I think hopefully some of these things will help as we all go on our journey. Thank you so much.
Hello friends, I'm excited the news that is about to come to your ears. A burden for the Lord is God's heartbeat to establish His will among His people, and most of the time emphasized within a time frame. I believe that in our time of prayer, the Lord has established a burden in our hearts, and that burden is to take the mandate and the mission of Eden Life Experience Center in encounter, equipping, and exploit to the highland part of Lagos. Wow, that's an exciting news. So do you stay in Lekki Phase 1, Phase 2, you stay in VGC, you stay in Chevron, Aja, Bogije Majek, Ogombo, Shongotedo, Awoyaya? We are excited. The vision is coming to you right now. You have prayed and the Lord has answered the prayers. And this is what we want to do for the next couple of weeks, even as we plan this invasion. If you are someone who is seeking to maximize his gifts, his abilities, his callings to serve the Lord and to serve humanity, I want to call you and your friends that you have. Join our workforce and volunteer community today as we gear up within this next couple of weeks for what the Lord is about to bring to the island part of Lagos. Therefore, this is what you need to do. Tell a friend, tell a neighbor, scan the barcode on the screen, or you can send your name and your address to the number showing on your screen. We are calling for everyone who wants to maximize their life, make a difference. Join our workforce today as we come to the island part of Lagos. The word of the Lord is coming so powerfully, a place where you have consecrated community of faith-filled people, a place where the word of the Lord is real. There is manifestation and demonstration of the power of God, and of course a place of kingdom discipleship. That is what we are bringing to the highland part of Lagos, and we are excited that the Lord has gone ahead of us. Something big has started to happen, and the Lord is starting with Eden Life Experience Center right there on the highland part of Lagos. I can't wait to see you at the other side. Start registering now, and I'm going to see you at the other side even as we plant this invasion. God is with us, and I know that His miracles are abounding. God bless you. Bye.
Big opportunity. So many small businesses. Why is nobody giving loans properly to small businesses? When you enter it, and then they show you shaggy, then you know why nobody is giving loans to small businesses. So, I mean, I think that some of the big challenges are, one, people. I think people is a very big challenge, right? People in terms of finding the right people to build with. I think we've been lucky to find a number of good people, but also along the line, right? People have also shown us shaggy. Myself and my co-founder were joking once that, there was this trend on Twitter once, which was horrible bosses. And we're like, when is someone going to do horrible employees? And also kind of like allow business people to rant on what they've been. So I think people is a big problem. But then there's also a people problem on the other side, which is also sometimes customers could be problems, right? And I give an example of, giving loans to SMEs. And people that just come and then they take loans and they have zero intention to pay back, right? And that's also something that you have to deal with, right? Unfortunately, it's not written on the forehead, and so you can't always tell, who's coming with the right intentions or not. So I think people is a big problem. Of course, infrastructure is a problem, right? Especially when you're building technology products, right? Everything is sort of like dollarized, right? And we're operating in a market where it's NAIRA, and there's no local infrastructure that you can rely on, right? Everything you have to rely on foreign infrastructure as well. So I think those are some of the big challenges.
Okay, thank you so much. So how do you identify problems that are worth solving, and what role does research play?
Interesting. So I would try to remember, there was a formula that someone gave once that was really, really, really helpful, right? And it was basically around valuable problems to solve. Because I think anyone who has any sort of iota of passion, walking around a place like Nigeria, you always find problems to solve, right? If you just look around this room, you can probably already identify 10 things, right, that you can sort of try to solve. However, I think the way the person put it was, number one is, are there just enough people? That is almost multiplied by what is the level of problem, but people's level of frustration is not that high, right? So they can manage it, right? And so which means that if their level of frustration is not high enough, it's going to be hard getting them to switch or getting them to pay for it. An example was when we first started Traction. Before we started doing payments, we thought we were going to solve the problem of inventory management for businesses. And that was our first product. Wrong idea. And what we found out was, for many of these businesses, yes, they know inventory. If you talk to them, they'll tell you that, oh, your inventory is a problem, but it wasn't something that was, a big deal. They could still manage, they could still run their business without it, right? When we switched to payments and lending was a different thing, right? No one can run a business without being able to accept payments. Everybody needs loans, right? And so just understanding the level of frustration is important to do that. The third sort of aspect of the formula was around how willing are people to actually pay for this thing, right? You could build a great, perfect product, but if nobody's willing to pay for it, directly or indirectly, you can't build a business, right? I think, I found really helpful there. And I think you mentioned one point on research, and I think it's important to highlight. Research, depending on how you run it, can be very deceptive, and you might end up with the wrong outcomes. Like I mentioned, before we built our inventory products, not exaggerating, we probably spoke to at least 40 or 50 business So we didn't just go and build it because, oh, we had the idea. No, we actually went and we spoke to, and they all said, yes, build it. We finished building it, and then nobody paid it. Nobody used them. The worst part, I think, my co-founder used to always say that even his own sister did not use the product. And that was when we did, like, you know what, okay, we're on the wrong path. So I think I always say that the best form of research is how quickly can you get something into the hands of customers. So at that point, it's no longer theoretical. It's basically, I now have something I'm giving you. Are you ready to pay for it? And today, with like things like low code tools, it's easier than ever for you to build something that at least, solves something and actually see whether people will buy it or not. So that's the best kind of research there is.
Okay, so what advice do you have for startups that are looking to scale beyond Nigeria?
So, scaling beyond Nigeria is great. Everyone aspires to it. There are many reasons why you want to do it, right? Not the least, the ability to diversify your earning income. However, before you sort of scale beyond, I think you need to ask yourself some fundamental questions. Is my product, have I actually sort of built a solid enough product, right? Do I have product market fit already for this product? Because if you're trying to scale something that is anyhow, right? The one thing is, Nigerians, we have a high tolerance for anyhowness. We know how to manage. Nigerian customers are patient, right? If not, nobody will be using, I won't mention any products. We're very, very patient, right? And myself and my wife were having this discussion over the weekend. We use a particular bank, and for the entire weekend, we logged into the bank app, and we couldn't see our balance, right? Talking of like moving our money, but we're still using it, right? So Nigerian customers have a lot of high tolerance and patience. It's very different when you start to scale outside Nigeria. People will not give you that level of patience. So is your product at the right level, right? That's one thing. Second is, have you also built internal capacity to manage that scale, right? Scaling is good, but scaling too fast can be dangerous if you have not built the capacity. Do you have the right structures, the right processes? Do you know how to manage different languages? Do you know how to manage different work cultures? Because what you will find, for example, is that the way you serve someone that is coming from, say, like a Francophone or French culture is completely different from someone that is sort of like more Nigeria, right? The first consulting project I did in Togo, I was completely shocked when at I think 12 or 1 o'clock, people said they're going home. They're going home for what? They're actually going home for lunch and siesta. And they actually literally go and they sleep in the middle of the day. And then they come back in the afternoon again, right? At the bank in France. And when they actually would not let you at 1 o'clock, the bank is closed. You can't come in. And that's just their culture. They made it work. They're still a developed country. And so knowing how to basically manage all of these different nuances is everyone should aspire to it, but you really need to make sure that you sort of build a capacity that allows you to scale before you do it too prematurely. There are too many examples of startups who have gone into other markets. They've quickly gotten their fingers burnt, and then they had to
Okay,
right? It's great to have an idea. It's great to have all of these things perfect. But if you haven't actually been able to put your own sweat, your own time, your own resources into getting some traction, it's going to be hard to convince anybody. So, I want to see something like, oh, we've built a first version of the product. We have gotten our first 3 or 5 customers, right? Or we've gotten XYZ revenue. There's nothing that sells better than just traction and progress, right? So I think that is the sort of like the other, the most important bit ultimately when pitching.
Thank you very much. The next person.
I think there was a question on the SMEs, right? And what you find, what is the difference, like what are the needs of SMEs that you can focus on? I think that the way I think about it is ultimately that large corporates, SMEs, at the sort of like fundamental, if you think about almost like Maslow's hierarchy, right? At the fundamental level, SMEs have exactly the same needs as large businesses. The level of complexity might be different, but every business wants to grow. Every business wants to be organized. Every business wants to attract the right people, right? So those needs are the same. The level of complexity is different. However, large businesses have the liberty, the resources to hire human beings to solve those things for them. SMEs cannot. And so generally, there's no, if you think about any area of operations, right? As far as you can sort of help SMEs to use tech, right? So that I, as that individual founder, technology can basically become that employee for me, you will identify opportunities. Whether it's how do I sell more, right? Can you sort of help them to sell more using like different